everyone, and thanks for hanging in here tonight. Thanks, I'd like to thank Piero for organizing this, and so Minerva Foundation for backing, supporting this evening. So I changed the title of this talk. I originally titled it A Translator's Tale, but translation for me has been an adventure. It's allowed me to, I've traveled, I've met people, and every time I do a project, it's a new world. Every book project, it opens up a whole new world for me. And as part of my work, I actually do have to physically travel, so these are, this is Shanghai, and Taiwan, Hong Kong. This is the oldest house in Shanghai from the Ming Dynasty, lotuses. These are the things that actually, these physical experiences inform my work. And luckily I have a digital camera, so I can share some of these things, at least the images of places that I've been with other people. But it really has been an adventure. And at the same time, tonight though, we're talking about digital things, things digital. And I guess it's more than the online. My original title was also, online resources. And I realized that there are other digital technologies that have been really useful to me. Increasingly, those, the tools that I use as a translator are online tools, and these are references. It's the research and reference part, and that's what I'll be talking about. I'll be talking about how these tools, how these resources have been helpful to me. And then, but also what the perils are, because I think without background in Chinese, they would be pretty useless. And I'd come up with some really interesting experimental poetry and things like that. But beyond that, it would not be the thing. So I'll be talking about the issues of translation, and then how various online resources and digital resources address those issues either effectively or less effectively. First thing, what is translation? And I'm listening in to various conversations in the room this evening. I know that there are a lot of languages represented here, and I'm just curious, how many people in the room are translators? Okay, what's your language?
English, Spanish, English.
Okay, yeah. And how many people in the room speak more than one language? Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot I don't have to explain to you just at the outset, because there are issues with translation that I think monolingual people have difficulty understanding. And one of those issues is this issue of mapping. That with language you have lexicon, you have the words, but then you have syntax, and that structure is what gives us the relationship between words. And this actually is, I'll talk about this later, that the syntax and context are things that condition what those words mean in any given situation. And that's where that's where I find that digital resources and computing have definitely fall short, But I'll definitely give you examples of that. All right, so this is one of the books I've translated. This is a novel I've done. I'm a literary translator, so before I go any further, I won't be talking about technical translation, legal translation, court interpreting. I won't. I translate fiction, like this is another novel, and poetry, and then I've also done subtitles. So what are the things we need when we do literary translation? I think, while all translation requires a combination of intuition and subjectivity on one side, and then information and fact research on the other hand, literary translation really threads a very narrow and it's a very rigorous discipline, because you have to be very well versed in the facts. You have to establish the objective content. But after that, you can't stop. You have to push it into creativity, and you have to make decisions that are based on subjective criterion. How does this passage affect, if I read something in Chinese, how does this affect me? How is it as poetry? if I translate it literally, oh, it's not poetry anymore. You know, the word that's the dictionary definition of something I want to use sounds terrible in a poem, and it's really not what the line, the poem is getting at. So what do? That's where the creativity comes in. So language, we have lexicon and syntax. And that is, when we're translating, we have to think about those things. We think about language, we think about context, we think about also communicating with the author who's communicating something to all of us. And then so there's a conversation that goes on. The context, it becomes very important because the context conditions how we read something. So what's the historical context of a poem or a novel? You know, how does that affect how I'm going to interpret it and render it into English? There might be geographical questions in something I'm translating, issues of material culture, architecture. I'm currently translating a historical novel that's set in the Ming Dynasty in the Yangtze Delta, you know, what later became Shanghai. There are historical figures that get mentioned. Just in passing, there are issues of the names of waterways in the area. There are architectural terms, you know, the author gets into things like glue making for scroll mounting. All of these things I have to run down to understand what she's saying, because this is not really garden variety, you know, everyday conversation, some of it. It's all very, you know, it's all deep background. Then there's a question of immediate surroundings and circumstances. How does that condition how we might translate something? And then lastly, there's, you know, when I'm stumped, I bug the author. I try not to bug the author too much. So if I'm stumped, I might ask a friend who's a native speaker or who has cultural knowledge. And then only if that, you know, then I save the questions for the author to resolve things that I don't understand. But the dictionaries and other resources, this is the information I try to run down on my own. First, though, I'm going to talk about this issue of immediate surroundings and circumstances and how that might affect something. So I'll talk about subtitles and Temptress Mood. So this was a movie by Chen Kaige, and it's set in this very, you know, this villa in the South China around the turn of the century, and it's very dramatic and very angsty, and there's some really intense scenes. And, you know, it's a very dysfunctional family. Everybody's addicted. Half of them are addicted to opium, and it's just really a sad situation. And there's all this unrequited love. So does anybody in the room, can anyone read this? It says gola, which the basic translation of this is enough. Just means enough. And this is a phrase that keeps on appearing in the movie over and over again in a number of scenes. And Miramax actually came to me with that job because they weren't happy with their initial subtitles. They were quite literal. So every time someone said gola, it said enough. And that didn't really, it didn't help the drama, right? It didn't advance the story. So depending on the scenes, I came up with all these. I never wrote enough. I never translated enough. Because sometimes it just meant stop, you know, what you're doing, or shut up, or leave me alone, or don't. It never really meant, you know, enough never really expressed what the screenwriter, the actors, director were trying to express in a scene. So that's one example of how a situational context is going to affect you. And this is something that you have to take into account. You have to have a lot of information at hand. And the simple dictionary definition or the first year Chinese, you know, vocabulary item is just not going to get you where you want to go. So here we are back to language. And then register, I just tossed register in. Who knows what register is? It's pretty much a term of art. They usually, linguists use it. It has to do with high-low, you know, high-low middle speech, you know, are you speaking, is it playgrounds, how kids are talking about playgrounds, how you're addressing the emperor, how you're addressing your parents, how a teacher talks to a student. That's register. And that is another thing you have to incorporate into your writing style when you're translating. So these are my old tools. Those are all my dictionaries, all my Chinese dictionaries. And, you know, for about 25 years, this was it. You know, the first 25 years of my life as a China scholar, especially this one, this little itty-bitty dictionary. That's a great little dictionary. And anybody that started Chinese when I did probably has a copy of that somewhere. This was a later one that I used later on. It's also pretty good. And then I've got other ones. Some of those have, you know, are really, really old style, and some of them are more modern. But that was it. And if it wasn't in one of those, if I didn't already know it, if it wasn't in one of those, I'd have to compile a list and ask a friend. And that could be pretty, it was hard work, right? All right, so enter the digital resources that I've been using for really barely a decade. The first thing that I was able to take advantage of was digital dictionaries. And after that, I sort of proceeded to online. When the technology was in place, then I went into online dictionaries. And then as we advanced further, image search. Image search is beautiful if you're looking for something in like material culture. You want to know what some kind of a gate is, some particular Chinese architectural feature, do an image search. If you want to know what some kind of food is, do an image search. You'll see pictures of it, and it does more for you than any dictionary definition could ever do for you, assuming you could even find it, which most of the time you can't. For historical things, Wikipedia, Baidu, then email and social media are of course the ways to connect with people and sort of crowdsource it. Okay, so there's my first digital dictionaries. These were great. And this one in particular, they had a stylus, which meant you could draw the character on the screen. You had to draw stroke by stroke, and you couldn't stop, because if you paused for even a moment, it thought you were done. And that was, that was kind of frustrating. So you sort of had to retrain yourself for it. This was brilliant though, because remember that little turquoise dictionary that was my old friend? Back in those days, there are two ways to look a Chinese character up in a dictionary. One is phonetically. If you know enough Chinese, you can make a really good guess, ballpark, what it sounds like. You can start looking in the phonetics part of it. But if you have no idea what it sounds like, or if it's one of those weird ones that you think should sound like something, but it doesn't, and it doesn't show up where you want it to, you have to do stroke by stroke. You have to count how many strokes, and then you have to look in an index that's arranged by the graphic organization. There's something called a radical, and that's the thing that is how you this is the classifier, the graphic element that is the classifier. How many strokes are in the radical? You go to that section, you find that radical, then how many more strokes, and you have to count them all. This was really, really arduous, really not fun at all. So with something like that, even if I had to retrain myself to write in this kind of fussy way, it was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. And it died after about 3 years. I got that one because they weren't making the other one anymore. But that one never really was that good. It had, it had a keyboard, but stylus-wise, it just wasn't happening. So then, luckily though, around the time those weren't working for me anymore, the online dictionaries got pretty good. The one I prefer is this one on top that it comes out of mainland China. Google Translate, which I'll talk about a little bit because it's sometimes really useful and sometimes it's just entertaining because they don't quite have it yet. And then this other one called Plico, which is an app which I have on my phone, and anything that has a touchpad, you could just write it down to Plico as well, which is really great. Okay, there's the one, there's that Chinese one, the mainland China one. I think it's actually produced by the people that bring us the Confucius Centers, which I'm not 100% crazy about Confucius Centers, but I really do like this dictionary. It's very deep and has a lot of really good classical material, really good background, so it's very good. But you have to read Chinese pretty well to use it, because sometimes there's only 1 or 2 English definitions in a whole page of Chinese text. Sometimes there's no English in a page of Chinese text. So online dictionaries are pretty good for lexical items, but not always. I was trying to figure out this phrase, which is read cha-chi. It was in this historical novel, and I was like, what is this? Something to do with the way things were arranged on a building or something like that. I put it in Google Translate, plug chi. Well, that's a real cop-out. Cha does mean plug, like plug in the wall, but it also means to stick in, or it has all kinds of kind of interrupt. It has lots of meanings, so why do they just go plug? And then they completely punted on that. They said chi. Chi actually means to come together or to arrange, to sort of be kind of neatly lined up. So I already knew more than they did. I was very disappointed. But I went to my other dictionary, and it was utterly useless as well. And it just says, so sorry, we can't find this word. So this is what Google told me, but this is what I realized. I had to look at the 2 words separately, and that was what it meant, just setting in side by side. likewise, in the historical novel, this is, and it's fancy, it's highfalutin Chinese, but this is not obscure. This phrase that means refinement, ting ting. Google Translate inexplicably said Kingston. Okay. This is a really typical Google Translate glitch. Actually, so then I looked at the other dictionary, stand tall, put on airs, have near, refinement. In the text, there's the ting ting. It gives you a little English, erect, upright, graceful. The real meat of it is down here. This is where you realize, oh, the woman in this scene is condescending to the other women. She thinks she's socially superior to them. That's why they're using ting ting. So, there's all this thought, all of this sort of thought and processing. Okay, syntax. So, I sort of was being hard on Google because they never say they don't know. So, when you've got something that's really modern and, a brand name, a company name, something that's really up to date, tech related, they're great. They're brilliant. You plug it in and it appears instantly. The other one is a little slower to load, but it's more for literary, it's much more literary. Syntax is where things break down because Google really wants to do syntax. And they never say, like I said, they don't know. So I thought for kicks, I actually wanted to know only one word in here, but for kicks I just tossed in the whole sentence. I cannot be your default outcome. Okay. This is not what it says, all right? This is not what it says. This is from a poem, Okay. So this word really does mean ending. Okay, the one that said outcome, default outcome, ending, conclusion, denouement, resolution. All right, that's what it is. Not default. Okay, the first, it says wufa. Wufa, you should. Wufa means there's just no way to do it. You should means to sort of prepare for something to set it up beforehand. So it has come to mean default in tech language. But if you take it apart, it's not just default. And this is kind of a love poem, and I just think default is not, this is not going to fit here. So what did I do? You should, okay, yeah, Google tells me it's default, not helpful. But I go to this one, the old-fashioned one, there's Confucius, that's Lao Tzu, they got Lao Tzu on there, that's good. They're branching out to Taoist from Confucius, that's Lao Tzu. All right, this one, they're just saying, we're so sorry, Bao Qian, it's like, I'm really sorry, we don't have this term. We haven't collected this term. But at least they admit they don't know, right? Which is good. Because what did I really come up with? Okay, the design floating in the coffee. Okay, this is it. It's not, this is the one that was the outcome, blah, 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 right? Is it ending? Neither you nor I could expect. That is much closer to what it says. And I'd probably still play with it, but because I could play with the English, ending neither you nor I could have ever predicted or have expected, but the line's going to get too long, and so we have to do our things like that. Okay, machine translation. So this is sort of an extension of that. This is another Google thing. Okay, passing a sweeping movements will face a familiar haze. That's what Google Translate gave for a familiar gloom swept across her face. All right. So again, it's the syntax. It doesn't know what to do with syntax. This book is a really great book. I'm just going to show it to you briefly. It's called Pink Noise. It's a book of experimental poetry. You can see through the layers. Experimental poetry by a poet in Taiwan. It's got found poetry from the internet on one side, and then machine translation facing it. And that's sort of like, that's still, Google's not really much past that level as far as not really figuring out the paradigm. The syntax just is not happening. Images are way more successful. This is a term that came in the novel Candy that I translated about Shanghai, and I couldn't for the life of me know what it was. I hadn't been to Shanghai in a long time when I translated this book around the year 2000. I didn't know what this was. It wasn't there when I'd gone there last. I asked the author, and she goes, this is Gao Jia. She goes, the Gao Jia, it's the Gao Jia. Well, that's really helpful, thanks. So I sort of faked something like overpass. Well, nowadays, you put that in image search. There it is. It's the elevated highway. And I hadn't been there physically, and without an image search, I really lost out on that. Okay, other favorites, Wikipedia, good for historical figures, botanical information, and I know that Wikipedia has a bad reputation in a lot of fields, but when it comes to Chinese history, as long as it's not modern history, you have to read carefully depending on who's writing the entry, but for historical figures, for literary figures from the past, it's really strong. These crowdsourced things are really great. And things like botanical information, there's a tree, I was trying to look up Nanmu. I looked it up, it was called Phoebe, and I think I ended up translating it Nanmu, just transliterating, because I thought it sounded better. And then again, I'm a literary translator, so I don't have to give this genus and all of that under scientific stuff. It's like, what's going to sound good? What's going to make my reader happiest? Email, social media, this is a term, 写靠着. It means shoe, and then cow means to lean on something. Like, well, what was that? It was, again, something in a historical novel. Like, there was a batch of scroll glue that went bad. It wasn't quite right. It was lumpy. So they gave it, the people that were making it, the masters of the house, gave it to the servants to use for that. And I'm, well, what is that? I look up in the dictionary, nowhere. I look up on images, I get that. All right, well, this is a novel set in 16th century China. None of that is germane, is it? Maybe what that lady is doing in the upper left, but it's so overexposed, who knows? Maybe it has something to do with that, because at least that looks like traditional shoe. So I went on Facebook, and I asked my friends on Facebook, and I heard back within minutes from two of my Chinese friends who grew up in the 1960s and 70s, and it has to do with using the glue to stiffen the fabric to make the shoes. And I'm still not sure if it's the upper or the sole, but the point is it did have to do with you need gluing together layers of cloth. This is email, questions on a poem. I don't have time to translate that right now, but I had some questions on a poem I was doing recently. So email with the back and forth with the author, and I did put these in different fonts, but it seems like that all went away. I ask a question, and then he answers back, and it happens, in just basically overnight. And before the days of, before email, before I had a Chinese operating system that could write email in Chinese, I didn't have that kind of access to authors. It was very hard to send those queries back and forth, and to sort of, to keep the work moving along quickly. So here's where I started. This is Hong Kong. This is Reflections, and sometimes I think about translation as it's it is sort of a reflection. I hope it's not overly distorted, or at least when it is a distortion of the original thing, at least it's pleasing. So, and that's where I'll leave you. My website's under construction, but you can always find me there.